This is what this thing looks like all wired up. And even though there is a lot going on in this legendary piece of gear, it's really not as complicated as it looks. It's actually only about to make a start, so let's do it. Let's remove all the wiring. What's left besides the obvious, meaning the XLRs, the tube sockets, the switches, the pots, the VU meter, are the input transformer, the output transformer, and the T4 socket. Now let's bring in the main board. As this is an early 60s design, we don't have a real PCB yet, but a turret board instead. And as you can see, the legs of the individual components are wrapped around and soldered to the turrets, while connections are made with wires or jumpers between the components. This is what this thing looks like in reality. And as you can see, it's no rocket science, it's actually pretty straightforward. We have mostly resistors and a couple of capacitors and additional components. There is some spots where you have to pay attention though, because there are some components that have a polarity, so you have to mount them oriented correctly, such as the rectifying diodes CR1 and CR2 and the electrolytic capacitor C10 right here. And there is one more component that you might probably find weird to be in a compressor, but it actually looks really cool. I'm talking about the NE2 neon light bulb right here. And no, it's not there to lighten up the inside of your compressor while the lid is open. It's more like a voltage regulator for the metering circuit. And then there's this thing here with the screw on top. It's a variable capacitor C4. It's responsible for the overall frequency response of the compressor. The lower its capacitance, the more high frequency roll off. Now, let's start to wire this thing up. I would always suggest to start with the power supply first, because then you can make sure it works properly and all the voltages are within spec, before you wire up the rest of the components throughout the circuit. First and most importantly, I connect the ground lug of the power connector to chassis ground. The live wire is connected to the power switch via the main turret board before going to the AC turret board, while neutral is going directly to the AC turret board. This little board is here to connect the primaries of our power transformer. The colors of the wires shown here are the actual colors of the Hammond 369JX power transformer I used for this build. Be aware the wiring shown here is for 120 volts as in the US, but in the e-paper I'll also show you how to wire it up for 240 volts. Coming up next are the secondaries, the red high voltage line and the green lower voltage 6.3 volts line, which will supply the tube heaters. Last but not least, we wire the high voltage and low voltage center taps to ground. All other wires from your power transformer, as an example shown here, the black and yellow wire, need to be cut and isolated with a piece of shrink tube and then stuff them somewhere inside the enclosure where they don't get in your way. As mentioned before, the low voltage line is there to supply the tube heaters, so now it's time to wire up the heaters as shown. And if you don't want to end up with a tube Opto hummingbird, really make sure you twist these wires tightly, from beginning all the way throughout the circuit to the end. Now, before we move on with the rest of the power supply, I will fade out the heater circuit because I think it'll distract you and will only confuse you more than it actually helps you. So, coming up next here are the filter capacitors for the power supply. As mentioned before, electrolytic capacitors have a polarity, so it's really important to mount them oriented correctly, because if you mount them in the wrong way, they will explode, which is kind of annoying and it stinks. The negative sign of the cap is always marked with a gray bar. Then we connect the capacitors to ground on the one side with the black wires shown here and the connecting wires to the rest of the circuit. Okay, now again, before we move on, I'll fade out the power supply so we can focus on the rest of the circuit. But before we start to wire it all up, we have to mount and solder in some additional components, such as the resistors and capacitors, followed by some jumper wires. The crossing jumper wires on the T4 socket are not only touching each other, but they actually are soldered together. And from there, this jumper construction is wired to chassis ground. Next, we can wire up the light bulb, and as we have AC here, as well as in the connection between the main turret board and the power switch, it's really important to twist these wires tightly. If we are done here, we can take a close look at the input section. And as you can see, it's only just a couple of wires. The only important thing to mention here as well is twist the wires between the input terminal board and the XLR connector. The same goes for the output section as well, only a couple wires, but also remember to twist the wires between the XLR connector and the terminal board. From there we can build up the amp section, which are a couple more wires, but it's still not that complicated. The larger gray wire is actually a shielded wire with two leads and shield wire to ground on one end. The big blue component in the center is the output capacitor C5. It's an electrolytic capacitor, so it has a polarity, which means orientation is important. The legs of C5 are covered with shrink tube in order to not get in touch with other parts of the circuit. In terms of the wiring layout, the amp circuit is surrounded by the gain reduction control circuit. And as you can see, we have a couple of shielded wires again. If you look at them closely, you can see that the white wire on the left that connects the limit compress switch, as well as the short orange one that connects the peak reduction pod to the mainboard, also have their shield connected on one end only. This is really important because if we connected the shield on both ends, again, we would end up with... And that's what none of us wants, right? I mean, at least not in our tube compressor. Anyway. Let's mount the VU turret board, which has only 4 resistors soldered to it as shown, before we wire up the rest of the metering circuit. Last but not least, we connect some additional ground wires, and then we are actually done! Yeah, that'll be the moment when you go,
Yeah! Look what I have created!